Every collector dreams of owning something irreplaceable, the kind of item that stops experts cold. Pawn Stars built its reputation on exactly those moments, ordinary people walking through that Las Vegas door carrying extraordinary history. Some pieces sold for thousands. Others walked out for millions. But behind the handshakes and the deals, several of the most valuable items ever brought through that door were quietly underpriced, dismissed, or let go for reasons the show never fully explained. And the full story is far darker than it appears. The gold and silver pawn shop didn't start as a television destination. It started as a family business. Richard Harrison, the man viewers would come to know simply as the Old Man, opened the shop on Las Vegas Boulevard in 1988. For more than 2 decades, it operated the way most pawn shops do. Quietly, locally, without much fanfare. Deals were made. Items changed hands. The world didn't notice. That changed in July 2009 when History Channel aired the first episode of Pawn Stars. The response was immediate. Within 18 months, the show was pulling an average of 8.2 million viewers per episode. That made it one of the highest-rated programs on cable television at the time, not just on History Channel, but across the entire cable landscape. A pawn shop in Las Vegas had somehow become must-see television. The cultural impact was real and measurable. According to a 2012 estimate by Forbes, foot traffic to the gold and silver had climbed above 4,000 visitors per day. People weren't just watching the show. They were flying to Las Vegas specifically to stand inside that building, but the version of the shop that viewers saw on screen was carefully constructed. What most people didn't know was the infrastructure running behind it. Expert consultants were on call. Legal teams reviewed significant transactions before cameras ever rolled, and producers pre-screened sellers before they walked through that door. The ordinary person off the street framing the whole premise of the show was often theater. Carefully managed, carefully edited theater. That system wasn't built to deceive. It was built for television. But it created something nobody planned for. It created a pipeline. A steady flow of rare, historically significant, genuinely valuable items moving through a retail environment that was optimized for speed, not accuracy. Items that deserved weeks of research were assessed in minutes. Items that deserved museum-level appraisal were handed off to a consultant in a backroom. And sometimes, not always, but enough times to matter, those items left for far less than they were worth. Think about this. If producers pre-screen sellers, does that change how you see the show? Drop your answer below. The comments on this one are worth reading. Of all the near misses in Pawn Stars history, few have generated more discussion among collectors than the segment involving an ornate, decorative egg. The seller who brought it and claimed it was authentic faberge, not a reproduction, not an inspired piece, the real thing, one of the most coveted categories of decorative art in the world. Faberge pieces are not simply expensive. They are historically singular. Created for Russian imperial royalty, they represent a level of craftsmanship that has never been replicated at scale. The appraiser brought in that day specialized in decorative arts. That was the right call on paper. But the assessment hit an immediate wall. There was no original documentation, no provenance paperwork tracing the egg's history. Without that paper trail, the appraiser couldn't confirm what it was. And in the world of high-value decorative arts, uncertainty almost always translates into a low offer. Rick Harrison offered $7,500. The seller walked. At the time, that might have seemed like a reasonable outcome. No deal, no loss. But context matters enormously here. In 2014, just 3 years after that segment aired, a nearly identical decorative egg sold at Christie's auction for $1.2 million. Same category, same general period, same absence of a clean, universally accepted paper trail at the point of initial discovery. $1.2 million. That same year, a separate verified faberge egg surfaced at an American flea market. It was examined and confirmed by Geza von Habsburg, one of the world's foremost faberge experts. According to BBC News coverage of the discovery, That single egg was valued at between $20 million and $33 million. It had been sitting unrecognized in ordinary hands. What those two events revealed, events that happened after the gold and silver segment, was something Faberge specialists had known for years. The absence of hallmarks does not automatically disqualify a piece from being authentic. Some eggs were produced outside the official Faberge workshop system entirely. The standard authentication checklist wasn't designed to catch every genuine piece. It was designed to catch the most obvious ones. Whether the egg that passed through that Las Vegas shop was real has never been confirmed. The show's production notes have never been released to the public. The appraiser's full assessment was never aired in complete form. What remained was a $7,500 offer, a seller who declined it, and a question that still hasn't been answered. The structural problem was now visible. A fast-moving retail environment, one optimized for television pacing and clean resolutions, is one of the least appropriate places on Earth to evaluate a potentially priceless artifact. Faberge authentication at the highest level takes months, sometimes longer. What happened in that segment took minutes. That flaw didn't disappear after the egg walked out the door. It followed the show into its next season, and into an item with an entirely different kind of historical weight. Season 6 brought in a lot of unusual items, but one segment stood apart not because of what happened on screen, but because of what the numbers revealed afterward. A seller arrived carrying what he described as an original signed manuscript connected to Confederate military leadership during the American Civil War. The item came with a letter of provenance. That's standard practice for historical documents, a written record attempting to trace where the piece has been and who has owned it. It doesn't guarantee authenticity, but it's a starting point. Rick brought in a Civil War historian to assess it. The historian's on-camera evaluation placed the document's potential value in the tens of thousands. That phrase, deliberately vague, intentionally broad, gave the negotiation room to move in almost any direction. Rick offered $6,000. The seller accepted. Here's what that number looks like in context. According to the Library of Congress archives, original signed documents from senior Confederate generals routinely sell at auction for between $40,000 and $250,000. The range depends on content, condition, and the specific figure involved. But the floor, the low end, is still nearly 7 times what that seller walked away with. Heritage Auctions records from 2015 to 2020 show at least 14 comparable Civil War documents selling above $80,000. Not outliers, comparable items. Regularly, $80,000 was closer to the baseline than the ceiling. The gap is significant, but what makes this case particularly striking is not the dollar difference, it's the time. The entire negotiation took under 4 minutes of screen time. In the world of rare historical documents, proper authentication alone typically requires between 30 and 90 days. Archival cross-referencing, ink analysis, paper dating, handwriting comparison against verified samples. None of that happened. For minutes. $6,000. For something potentially worth more than 40 times that amount. The document's current status has never been disclosed. Whether it was resold privately, held in a collection, or quietly sent to auction, nobody outside the transaction knows. The Confederate manuscript was just the beginning. If you want to see exactly how far these numbers go, and the one item that dwarfs all of them, hit subscribe. The next chapter is where this gets truly hard to believe. Sports memorabilia has always been the most unpredictable corner of the collectibles market. Unlike fine art or historical documents, the value of a sports card doesn't follow a clean logic. It shifts with a player's legacy, with cultural moments, with the appetite of a single private collector willing to pay what no one else will. 1 year a card is worth thousands. 3 years later, the same card in the same condition is worth millions. The market doesn't apologize for that volatility. It just moves. In 2013, a seller walked into the gold and silver carrying a pre-war era baseball card. Not a modern card. Not a reproduction. a genuine artifact from the earliest period of American baseball card production, the kind of item that serious collectors spend entire careers hunting for. Experts who have since reviewed the segment believe the card was a near-mint Honus Wagner T206. If that identification is correct, the seller was holding one of the rarest collectible items on the planet. Rick declined to make an offer. The reason given on screen was uncertainty about authentication. No deal was made. The seller left with the card. That decision, whether right or wrong, carries a specific financial weight. A Honus Wagner T206 in PSA Grade 5 condition sold at auction in 2021 for $3.75 million, according to Sports Collectors Digest. That's not a record-breaking outlier achieved under unusual circumstances. That's a graded mid-condition example selling in a relatively routine auction environment. Even a heavily worn copy, Grade 1, the lowest end of the scale, consistently fetches above $500,000. At the time of the taping, estimated to be somewhere between 2012 and 2013, comparable sales already placed the card's value above $1 million. The market hadn't peaked yet, but it had already moved far beyond anything a pawn shop negotiation could reasonably capture. Whether the card brought into the gold and silver was genuinely a Wagner T206 was never independently confirmed. No third-party grading service assessed it on camera. No archival comparison was performed. But multiple collectors who later viewed the episode clip on online forums pointed to specific visual characteristics they considered consistent with authentic T206 stock, particularly the ink depth and the cardboard yellowing patterns, which are notoriously difficult to replicate convincingly in reproductions. The refusal may have been the right call. Authentication caution is legitimate, especially for an item at that price level. Or it may have been the most expensive pass in the show's entire history. That uncertainty is precisely the point. In a world where a single slip of printed cardboard can be worth more than a house, more than several houses, a 4-minute assessment, and a polite refusal carry consequences that nobody standing in that room may have fully calculated, the stakes had been climbing with every segment. The Faberge egg, the Confederate manuscript, the baseball card, each one larger than the last, but what came next proved the ceiling was much higher than anyone had assumed. Season 9 of Pawn Stars aired without the kind of moment that makes headlines. No viral clip, no record-breaking offer, just a steady rotation of items moving through that familiar counter. One segment, in particular, passed without much notice at all. A seller brought in a flintlock rifle. Not a decorative piece, not a Civil War-era reproduction. What appeared to be an original colonial American flintlock, the kind carried by soldiers and militiamen during the Revolutionary War. The engravings on the stock were consistent with late 18th century craftsmanship. The wear patterns suggested age that couldn't be faked easily. To anyone with a trained eye, it was immediately interesting. The in-house appraiser that day was a specialist in antique weapons. His assessment placed the rifle's value somewhere between $8,000 and $15,000. Rick offered $10,000. The seller accepted. The deal took minutes. For 2 years, nothing about that transaction drew attention. Then, in 2016, a flintlock rifle matching the segment's description appeared at a Cowan's Auctions event. It sold for $187,000. A 2017 post in the American Society of Arms Collectors newsletter detailed the follow-up investigation by arms historians who connected the two items. The newsletter stopped short of a definitive conclusion, but the description, the engravings, and the provenance timeline aligned closely enough to raise serious questions. Those questions didn't exist in isolation. According to auction records maintained by James D. Julia, incorporated colonial-era flintlocks with documented provenance regularly sell at auction for between $50,000 and $400,000. The $10,000 offer wasn't just low. It was structurally disconnected from what the market had consistently demonstrated those items were worth. But the most troubling detail didn't come from auction records. It came from a person who was present during the taping, A production assistant, speaking anonymously to a collector's forum sometime after the episode aired, claimed the appraiser had privately believed the rifle was worth significantly more than the range given on camera. According to that account, the appraiser felt constrained, not by doubt about the item's value, but by the show's time structure and the production requirement to reach a resolution within the segment. The claim was never verified. Left Field Pictures, the production company behind Pawn Stars, did not respond to requests for comment on the record. The appraiser has not publicly addressed it. What it suggested, if true, was something more uncomfortable than a simple miscalculation. It suggested that the system itself, the format, the pacing, the need for a clean on-camera conclusion, may have been working against the seller from the moment they walked in. Most people who've inherited something old have no idea what it's actually worth. Maybe something in your own attic is sitting exactly like this rifle did, valued fast, valued wrong. If that's ever happened to you, say so below. What was left on the table that day, $170,000 or more, walked out the door in a seller's hands who may never have known what they truly held. But the rifle, the card, the manuscript, the egg, none of them represent the largest single undervaluation in the show's history. That distinction belongs to something else entirely, something that had no business being in a pawn shop at all. Of everything that ever passed through the doors of the gold and silver pawn shop, one transaction stands apart. Not because of the drama surrounding it, not because of a heated negotiation or a dramatic walkout. It stands apart because of what the numbers reveal when placed side by side, and because the explanation that emerged afterward was perhaps the most quietly devastating of all. The family who brought the collection in wasn't looking for a windfall. They were looking to liquidate. The items belonged to a former aerospace contractor, someone who had worked within the American space program during one of its most consequential periods. What the family carried through that door was not merchandise, it was documentation. Original NASA mission planning notes, annotated trajectory calculations, and what two independent document appraisers, whose assessments were later shared on a collector's forum, believed were original handwritten notes by a senior engineer directly connected to the Apollo program. Rick Harrison offered $45,000 for the entire lot. He cited condition concerns and the difficulty of authentication. The family accepted. 18 months later, the market answered that offer with a very different number. A collection of NASA documents described as nearly identical in scope and origin, authenticated by the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, was sold through a private auction handled by RR Auction in Boston. According to Space.com's 2019 coverage of aerospace memorabilia markets, that collection sold for a combined total exceeding $2.3 million. Not for a single item, for a comparable lot. The kind of lot that had walked out of a Las Vegas pawn shop for $45,000, the market didn't stop there. According to a 2021 report in Air and Space magazine, original Apollo-era engineering documents with credible attribution have since been valued by private collectors at as high as $5 million. The category had become one of the most aggressively pursued areas in historical memorabilia. Institutions, private foundations, and individual collectors were competing for exactly the kind of material that family had brought in. The gap between $45,000 and $5 million is not a formatting error. It is not the result of an unusual market spike or a single eccentric buyer inflating the numbers. It is, by almost any reasonable measure, one of the largest known undervaluations in the entire history of televised collectibles trading. What has never been fully resolved is the question of intent, whether the production team internally flagged the potential value of the collection and chose not to pursue proper authentication, or whether the significance of those documents was simply lost in the noise of a fast-moving production schedule remains unclear. A former segment producer addressed that question directly in an anonymous account shared with a collector's publication in 2022. The answer they gave was not one of conspiracy or deliberate manipulation. It was something simpler and in many ways harder to accept. There was no malice, they reportedly said. There was just speed. Speed. That was the entire explanation. A production environment built around resolution, around clean endings, around segments that fit inside a television format. That environment had processed a collection of Apollo-era documents in the same way it processed everything else. Quickly, finally, without the 30, 60, or 90 days that material genuinely required. A museum would have paid 100 times the offered amount to own what that family walked in with. Instead, a $45,000 check changed hands, the cameras moved on, and the collection disappeared into private ownership. The Faberge egg, the Confederate manuscript, the baseball card, the Revolutionary War rifle. And now this, each case different in its details, each one connected by the same underlying reality, that speed and television and genuine historical value are a combination that rarely ends well for the person on the other side of that counter. That NASA collection is the most documented case, but it isn't the only one. There's a second category of items that left that shop, things Rick bought, quietly resold, and never discussed on camera. That story is separate, and it goes somewhere unexpected. That's the next video.